What if I told you that between 1854 and 1929, up to 200,000 children were loaded onto trains in America, and a lot of their paper trail just disappears? No photos with their birth families, no full names that match, and in some cases, not even a real birth date. Imagine trying to build a family tree and you hit a wall at one child who just appears in the Midwest in 1887, and everything before that is a mystery. That's not some rare case. That's the Orphan Trains story. The official version sounds simple. In the mid-1800s, cities like New York and Boston were packed with poor and homeless kids. Reformers said, "We'll save them." They created a plan: take those children off the streets, put them on trains, and send them west to new homes. Between 1854 and 1929, most trains moved around 200,000 children to small towns across America. On paper, it sounds almost heroic, right? But here's where it gets weird. For something that massive, something that ran for 75 years, the records are shockingly thin. If this was the biggest child relocation in US history, why can't so many descendants today find basic things like the child's original last name, the ship they came on, or the parents they were taken from? Think about that for a second. 200,000 kids is not a rounding error. Let's start with the official story first. In 1853, a minister named Charles Loring Brace founded the Children's Aid Society in New York City. He looked at the thousands of street kids, newsboys, and children of poor immigrants and believed the answer was to move them out of the city and into rural, Christian homes. A year later, in 1854, the first orphan train left New York for Dowagiac, Michigan. The idea was called placing out. The city would gather children, label them as orphans or neglected, and send them west to be adopted or taken in as farm helpers. The Children's Aid Society and later similar groups claimed this was a moral rescue mission. They said these children would be raised in fresh air, with good values, instead of growing up in crime-filled slums. On paper, it's a neat story. But when you look closer, the holes start to show. First, a lot of these kids were not true orphans. Many had one living parent, or relatives, who were poor, sick, or recently arrived immigrants. The official explanation was that this was still in the child's best interest. But when those kids were shipped west, there often wasn't a clear system to track their birth families. How do you lose the name of a living mother? Now picture what this actually looked like. A train would arrive in a small town in Kansas, Nebraska, or Iowa. The children would be brought into a church or a town hall. Local families would come in, look them over, sometimes check their teeth or muscles, and then pick one. Sometimes contracts were signed that said the child would be fed, clothed, and schooled. But the screening of those families was often minimal, and the follow-up was weak to almost nothing. Official documents say there were agents who were supposed to check on the placements. Yet those agents were few, the territories were huge, and much of the follow-up depended on volunteer committees in each town. Even at the time, critics said children were getting lost in the system, misplaced in records, or stuck in abusive homes with no easy way out. If there's no strong paper trail, what happens when a child runs away or disappears? Here's another layer. The Children's Aid Society and other groups did keep records. We know that because their archive still exists in places like New York. They wrote down names, ages, where a child was sent, and sometimes you took them in. But now, generations later, descendants trying to trace those lines run into three big problems: missing files, wrong information, and privacy walls. The National Orphan Train Complex, which studies this history, openly says it. First, there are not always records of the children in the first place. Second, when there are records, they're sometimes inaccurate, names misspelled, ages guessed, birthplaces wrong. Finally, strict privacy laws in states like New York now block access to some birth and adoption records for descendants. So even where a file might exist, you might never see it. How many family stories stop cold because of that? Think about the numbers. If 200,000 children were sent out, you would expect hundreds of thousands of matching records departure lists, full adoption papers, court orders, detailed logs of new names and old names. Instead, what people actually find are scattered fragments. A line in a ledger, a town newspaper saying a carload of orphans arrived yesterday, maybe a brief contract, sometimes nothing at all. And that missing information isn't just random. It hits right at the thing that matters most to future families: original identity. Many children had their names changed, sometimes immediately, sometimes later. Ages were adjusted to make them seem younger or older to fit what a family wanted. A Michael O'Connor from New York might become Mike Connor in Kansas, with a new birthday and a new story. By the time those children grew up, their earlier selves had been blurred on paper. Now mix that with one more twist from U.S. history: the loss of the 1890 federal census. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C., where the 1890 census schedules were stored. Most of those population records were damaged by fire, smoke, and water, and later, almost all of them were destroyed. Today, genealogists say that gap is one of the biggest holes in American family history between 1880 and 1900. Think about what that means for orphan train kids. Many of them were placed in the 1880s and 1890s. The 1880 census might show a child still in New York, maybe in an institution or with birth family. The 1900 census might show the same child, now a teenager or adult, living in Nebraska or Iowa under a new last name. But that middle snapshot, the 1890 census, that could show the moment they appear in a new home, is gone. So the exact point where their identity shifts is often invisible. And remember, this placing out idea didn't happen in a calm, modern system. It ran before there were federal child protection laws and long before modern foster care rules. The orphan trains were a private, voluntary experiment run by religious and charity groups, with very little government oversight. There was no national database, no unified way to track where each child ended up, and no requirement to preserve records forever. So what do we actually know? We know the rough totals. Historian estimates and the Children's Aid Society's own reports say that by 1920, and this is where modern descendants come in, there are people today who only find out in their 60s or 70s that a grandparent was an orphan train rider. They start digging and hit the same pattern: a few lines in a ledger, a vague mention, no birth certificate, and no clear link back to Europe or the East Coast. Many reach out to the National Orphan Train Complex for help, and even that museum warns them that they may never get solid answers because the records either never existed, were wrong, or are legally sealed. Did anyone explain to that child why they were chosen to go and their sibling wasn't? If they did, where are those pages? On the darker side, reports and later research showed that some children were used mainly as farm labor or domestic servants. Without strict screening or follow-up, some ended up in abusive homes. If a child in that situation had no strong paper identity and no easy way to prove who they were, how hard would it be for someone to erase them from the story? No school record, no church record with a birth name, no census snapshot in 1890, just a body in a field or a runaway who never comes back. The legal side adds another twist. For a long time in the 1800s, adoption itself wasn't always a clear, formal legal process the way it is now. Laws were changing and varied between states. Some placements were more like long-term fostering or indenture, not a sealed court adoption. That means there might never have been a full legal file to begin with, just a private agreement, a church note, or a letter. If those papers stayed in a town clerk's drawer or a family trunk and then got tossed, the link is gone forever. And it doesn't stop there. Today, even when a record exists, state privacy laws can keep it closed to grandchildren and great-grandchildren. New York, for example, has strict rules about releasing birth and adoption information, even for people who know they came from the orphan trains. The idea is to protect personal data. But for families trying to heal an old break, that protection feels like another locked door. How do you reconnect a broken line if the proof is locked up or destroyed? What's wild is how this pattern shows up in other places too. Think about all the other times children have been moved or separated in history and how often the records are lost or incomplete. Even in very recent years, government documents have admitted there was no solid central system to track separated families at the border, leaving kids and parents disconnected because of poor record keeping. Whenever the paperwork is weak, the people become easier to forget. So with the orphan trains, you've got this strange mix, a huge, well-known program, praised in newspapers, talked up by reformers, and even honored in museums. And yet, on the level of individual lives, a fog. People know the trains ran. They know children lined up in town halls. They know some riders kept quiet about it their whole lives. What they don't know is who a lot of those kids really were before the train whistle blew. And this isn't just one isolated case. When you zoom out and look at 19th and early 20th century records, you keep hitting the same problem. Fires that wipe out whole censuses in 1921, local courthouse fires that quietly destroy adoption and guardianship papers, charity groups that kept their own private files and later lost them, or donated only a part of them to archives. Over and over, the trail breaks right where a fragile or controversial story sits. The orphan trains are one of the clearest examples because the numbers are so big and the impact is so personal. A child steps onto a train in New York as the son or daughter of Irish, German, or Italian immigrants. They step off in Kansas or Minnesota as a farm helper with a new name and a half-true backstory. Then a national census that might have caught that switch burns in a government building in 1921. A century later, their great-grandchild is online, wondering why everything before 1900 is just blank. In the next video, we'll dig even deeper into how many other lost record events line up with big social experiments like this fire's missing files and sudden changes in how and what the government decided to keep. We'll look at how entire neighborhoods, institutions, and even cities had their paper history wiped out, and what that means for anyone trying to rebuild the truth of their family line. If you're starting to see the pattern too, do me a favor right now, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're uncovering these erased stories every single week. Drop a comment and tell me, what do you think really happened with the orphan train records? And do you have a family mystery in this time period? I'll read every single one. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.